Excellent. Great. I was wondering if I needed to introduce everybody, but apparently I don't. So that's great. We're going to, on the heels of ITRC's release of their identity breach report and the new biometric working group recommendation, advocating for consumer protections for once and how biometrics can support stronger identity assurance for everyday people in the United States. We have this great board to talk, answer a few questions about how biometrics can play a role in devaluing stolen identity data. And Stephanie came up with a great question. What do we mean by devaluing identity data, and why is this important, Stephanie?
Great. Can you hear me? Am I on?
I can hear you.
Not yet. Yeah. Oh, okay. Gotcha.
Good.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, thank you very much for hosting and for this great day. So I think the backdrop of the last two speakers really says it all. You know, what is it we're trying to do? What is the attack vector? The attack vector is textual information about you, your biographical information, your name, your address, other information about you. And a lot of what we do when we're doing identity verification is we're checking that information in various means. We're pulling that information in various means. From the data breach point of view, that is the major attack vector for the data breaches, is that information that can be coalesced from multiple sources, you know, either through the stolen data, through the dark web, through even legitimate sources of data, and put together to create a profile for an individual. And I was just about to text my three young adult children to freeze their identity every time I come to this workshop. I froze mine last year after this workshop, and I need to remind them to do theirs. And so why is this, such an attack vector? Because anybody can gather that information and type it into the boxes, right? That can be done by a person, that can be done by a bot. And so where's biometrics in this? Because I think the common question that you get is, well, that's just another data point, right? Like your name, like these other things. And I think it is not the same. It's fundamentally different from these textual pieces of information, because you're involving sensors, right? You're involving AI, right? You're adding additional kind of layers of security that make it much more difficult for the attackers to use that data, even if they steal it. And so what is that? What am I talking about? And those of you who know me know I've been talking about it for 20 plus years. Is biometrics, everyone understands there's a matching piece, right? You're matching against some reference. But the second step is generally been called liveness, right? So what is liveness? It's taking extra measurements, putting in extra features, including potentially challenge response features, to create some, liveness to the session that then makes it much more difficult for the attackers to bypass. And so I think there was a recent breach that I was reading about. And what was the breach? Well, causing it to fall back to PIN because they couldn't break the biometrics, right? So the liveness piece not only helps with things like photo fraud, right? Taking a photo of an individual, but also what we call injection. And I think the last question was really related to the generative AI. You may say, well, wait, there's generative AI, that makes live things. Well, again, it isn't a panacea, because those things need to be injection, and we can create live interactions between a real user that makes it very difficult to even create a deep fake. So that was a long answer, but I hope that I've kind of, give you an idea of where biometrics plays a role.
Well, thank you very much. I think it's interesting to note. In fact, I read an article very recently that talked about the wave of data breaches over the past 10 years or so, and how they characterize that wave as the capture phase of a crime wave, right? Capturing the important data. And now we are entering the harvest phase of this crime wave. And you can see it show up in the statistics. But I'm not exactly clear how biometrics will play a role in making sure that this is the person who they claim to be. Arun, you're doing a lot of work and some pretty incredible work at the Department of Homeland Security. How do you see biometrics helping verify and identify and authenticate people as they present themselves?
Sure. So first of all, thanks a lot, Jay, and thanks for the organizers for putting together such a great organization, a great meeting. Before I start, I actually probably should make a caveat. I'm here as a private citizen, not representing Department of Homeland Security, because I'm serving in a role as an advisor to the ITRC. So for ethical reasons, I just need to be clear that anything I say is not on behalf of Department of Homeland Security. It's just my expertise that I've built up in the area of biometrics. Yeah, why does biometrics provide value, right? It's a hard act to follow, Stephanie, but I'll try to say a couple of things about that and liveness. As Stephanie mentioned, the data we have that we use a lot of times to allow people to apply or to go through vetting and proofing processes, it's textual information. It's information about an individual. However, none of that necessarily ties back to corporeal person, right? Like, I used to watch Star Trek: The Next Generation. I used to love the word corporeal, but it means like the physical body of a person. There's nothing that binds that information back to a living human being somewhere, except for biometrics. And the value that biometrics comes into play is it's used in the vetting and the proofing process, and it can subsequently be used in authentication or verification processes downstream to make sure that it's still the same person who has it, right? I'm Arun Vamori and I have this badge. But if I hand this information to Stephanie and she goes around with the badge, somebody might actually think she's Arun Vamori, right? We don't necessarily tie back to that original identity proofing process, but biometrics allows you to do that, right? I think it's really funny that there's so much stuff in the media. I saw some movies on Netflix where people are printing and making their own identity documents, committing fraud at scale, and they're just swapping out the photo, right? We have a human brain here that does a lot of facial recognition, right? I did it just now and I realized, oh, there are people I know here. I should probably put in that disclaimer so that they don't confuse what I say as a position of the department. But we use that with the physical IDs. I think the challenge though is, it's one thing when the biometric process is happened by a trusted entity and you know, and you trust that person or that method by which you make that decision, like, yeah, this looks like the same person. But now with basically how technology's changed over time, people are doing things remotely through their computer, through their smartphone, and asserting their identity. And we like using selfies because we do it all the time, right? Even if we're not doing identity proofing, people are doing a lot of selfies. And this is where face, liveness detection and presentation attack detection comes into play to make sure that it really is that person. Otherwise, you can go find photos of me online. You can submit that for an identity verification process. Maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. It depends on the protections that the organization has put in place. So hopefully that clarifies like why biometrics is valuable, and I think why liveness and presentation attack detection is valuable, to make sure that it's still that same person and it's not just a replay attack. Because otherwise, if we don't have the liveness component, for example, it's no different than using facial recognition as you would like typing in a name, because our data, unfortunately, is everywhere.
Thank you very much. There's a big difference between matching someone's face to an identity and verifying who they are when they're standing right in front of you. In fact, people aren't very good at it unless it's like their mother. We all know our mother's face and our mother's voice, right? But people aren't very good at that. But when you talk about the internet and this distributed, unsupervised environment, there is almost no way to know who is claiming an identity online. And so part of the point of all of this is to promote biometrics as the only authenticator that's derived from an actual physical human being, right? So, we're kind of at this epiphany phase. We're starting to roll out these systems, and doing a lot more research about it. You know, there's a lot of debate out in society today. Are biometrics bad? Is the government following us? Are they biased? Or, you know, there are some issues with it. And I like to think that this is showing that biometrics are now entering the mainstream because we're framing proper and ethical use, right? But, you know, James, what do you think happens if we don't implement biometrics? What are the implications of doing nothing at this point?
First of all, I would say, whatever they said, I agree.
The smart guys.
Well, you know, it's an old boss of mine. Some of you in this room may know him, Dennis Thomas. He always said, I can't tell you what will happen if we do something. I will only tell you what can happen if we don't. And if we don't do anything, we're going to get exactly what we're getting, but we're going to get more of it over time. And if we like what we're getting today, then don't do anything. If you don't like what we're doing today, we have to find a different way of verifying individuals' identities using liveness and biometrics and all of the other things that we know that can be beneficial. But if we keep going down the path of we're just relying on data that's been compromised time and time and time again, and will continue to be compromised time and time and time again, we're going to have more and more identity crimes. It's no more complicated than that. Now, that's not to say that data isn't valuable. It is an important component, but it is just that. It is a component. And we have to adjust our systems to be able to use what we have and add to it the value of the biometrics and the biometric processes necessary to validate that actual new piece of information. So Jeremy says all the time, going from something you have to something you are, something that is about you, that is unique to you. And that will help. What is the concept of this is devalue stolen data. If there's that one other element out there now that can negate your ability to use my data, that's going to reduce the value of it, and the bad guys will move on. They'll find something else.
That's fantastic. Anybody else want to take a shot at that one? No, not yet.
I would just say, you know, to plus one, number one, what James and my other colleagues here on the panel have said. I mean, what's the old saying? The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And I think, you know, we'll get into this, I think, a little bit later, but at least from my point of view as an advocate and somebody who cares a lot about privacy and also data security, I recognize that that we can't keep doing the same thing. And so, you know, I am looking for new solutions to address this because the harm is real, and continuing to hope that this will be solved without doing something new is one that will just result in even more consumers being harmed.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And Lord knows, we've been seeing these data breaches for years, decades, right? And it seems like not much of what's been deployed has worked very well in the past. So maybe it's time to start introducing some new concepts, but that again raises the opportunity for fear mongering. It raises the opportunity to try and construct a proper framework with which to use technology that can scare some people. And, you know, the political class have opinions about a lot of things, that some of them are informed and some of them aren't. But there's a lot of opportunities to be nervous about biometrics. So John, you know, what are some of the unintended consequences that we need to protect against as we deploy biometric capabilities out there?
Yeah, I mean, so the unintended consequences obviously are where the use of this biometric data, I think would all agree is a net good use for consumers and society, which is to verify, make consumers more and their data less valuable to hackers, and ultimately reduce the harm that accrues because of fraud and identity theft. At the same time, like I see that benefit very clearly, but recognize that if this tool, this biometrics, and the data that on which it relies, these biometrics, are misused, that there are also potential costs. And those costs can fall particularly hard on individuals who are least prepared to address that harm. Thinking of marginalized populations, communities of color, disabled Americans, for whom biometrics has rightfully raised some suspicion. They recognize that there is a history of biometric and biometric type data being used to exclude and marginalize them. So, oh, sorry, it's not on. How's that? Better? Good?
No? Now, good. Okay. So for those in the back who couldn't hear me, TLDR version is biometric verification, good, lots of promise. Also, the tool can be used for bad. And I think we need to be very careful about how it's deployed because the potential downside is real and is there. But it's certainly one I think I'm personally doing a cost benefit analysis as somebody who comes to this debate with sort of an innate skepticism and concern about the use of data like biometrics that is immutable. Like I can't change my face. And I'm saying that as somebody from a fairly, from a position of comfort, a white guy, fairly well off. So I'm certainly even more concerned for people who don't have the same sort of positions of power and privilege that I do.
Thank you very much. I'm going to audible out of this one just for a second and see if I can drill into this a little bit more. I'd like to ask Stephanie and Arun, what are some of the technical ways that we can mitigate the risks of using biometrics?
You want to go first this time?
Sure. So keeping in mind that these comments are mine and mine alone, right? I think number one is judicious use of biometrics. I don't think biometrics should be a silver bullet solution. It's not. If anything, what you can do is collect a lot more data and make it put it in more people's databases and more people's systems and have it be misused in other ways. Right? I think there should be careful thought about whether biometrics is adding value or not to a particular situation. I think there should be a possibility where people have relatively anonymous transactions. Right? Why do we need to get so much data from all people for all things? I think the more data we collect, the more we put people's data at risk, right? So there should be a thought there about what is enough, or how do we do what the different organizations need to do and minimize the risk to the users as well, because otherwise you end up putting more data at risk when you just basically create these honeypots, right? If you use biometrics to do it well, right? Be very specific about what technologies you use, right? Make sure you're using stuff that's been tested. Look at who's testing them. Figure out if that's actually a trustworthy entity. I think you have to look at things like complementary technologies like liveness and proofing detection, but those have to be tested too. Basically, we need to make sure that more information is available to system owners, to business owners, so that they can make informed decisions about whether these technologies add value to their process and actually reduce risk versus compromising individuals' data. And what part of that also needs to look at more than just dollars and cents, right? It needs to look at how do these things actually work. During the pandemic, things changed. A lot of stuff had to go online. But I don't know that we have a lot of data about a lot of things that we do today and figure out whether or not what really are the risks. The challenges are that sometimes you are going to have, let's say, minimum thresholds that people will put out and say, above this, you're okay, just don't use stuff below this. Well, the bad actors don't think that way. They are financially motivated, they are smart, they have the resources of very large organizations, and they are increasing and improving their attacks all the time. Cutting it off at the minimum thresholds is not how they're going to work, right? We always need to be thinking ahead. We always need to be thinking what else we can do to minimize risks. I'm not sure if that's fully answering your question, but hopefully Stephanie will fill in the blanks.
Yeah, great. I think I would add, I of course agree with all of that. I would add the use case for how it's used is very important, right? Because when we just say the word biometrics, it applies all kinds of use cases, right? From from what we know today on our mobile device, but all the way to, surveillance, kind of in states, authoritarian states, and tracking your every movement, right? And so that makes it really complicated for a technology to kind of carry all this baggage, right? Of the potential use cases. It's a simple tool. It's how it's used that makes all the difference. And so, I've worked with the Biometrics Institute in terms of kind of explaining how the various use cases lay out from one-to-one to the many different ways one-to-many can work. So check that out, because I think that's helpful. The National Academy of Sciences and Engineering just released a report on facial recognition that delved into some of these, very, important issues as a society, because I agree with both of you. There are use cases that I find unacceptable. But so saying just, well, we're just going to use face recognition, right? To me, like boom, things pop in your head, that are use cases that are, really, truly unacceptable. And so, being able to articulate that as the experts in the field as to what this, how you're using the data, I think makes a big difference. And kind of back to your points about your biometric not being secret, I think, making that connection and helping others make connection to the fact that liveness, that connection between the biological and the digital, is the key piece that, you're much more able to do because you have cameras and sensors and, accelerometers and interactions, challenge responses that make that stolen biometric data not useful where textual data would be useful.
That's great. Thank you very much. So there's the scientific approach to protecting biometric data and by default protecting consumers. And, again, I'm very privileged to support the Identity Theft Resource Center, and they're the premier consumer identity theft victim advocate out there. FaceTech is also a proud member of the BIC, and FIDO is doing a lot of excellent work in biometrics as well. And so there's a lot of sort of geeking out about this stuff out there, but I'm not sure that everyday people and maybe bureaucrats and politicians really understand this stuff, and they may not have time to dive into it like most of us. So John and James, I'm really curious to hear how you think, if you had 2 minutes to explain to somebody why biometrics should be used and why they should feel safe using biometrics, how would you do that?
I'll go first, please.
Okay. 2 minutes to explain to hypothetically, right. So what I would say is, I would start off by saying, here's the cost of what we're doing now. The cost of what we're doing now is $8.8 billion in fraud losses, just reported losses at the FTC last year. 1.1 million identity theft reports, 2.4 million fraud reports. That's an increase in losses from 2.6 billion in 2021. So what we're doing now isn't working, and your constituents, Senator, are getting harmed by this. Biometrics has the potential to affect those numbers. And it's not a silver bullet. It's not going to stop everyone. And like you said, it may not be useful in every context, but it is something different than what we're doing now. And I think you should get behind it. That said, I would say that this is still a technology that we shouldn't just give carte blanche to be used willy-nilly across the economy. Data retention, for example, is a big one that I would say we need to have safeguards in place. Make sure that if I am providing biometric data in order to verify who I am, that data, ideally in my world, would not be retained and be securely deleted as quickly as possible. That data would be encrypted. Importantly, that data should be used in a consent-based framework, which is weird coming from a privacy advocate who thinks that notice consent is a terrible model that's broken forever. But when it comes to biometrics, I think that a consent-based model is still one that we should embrace. That said, consent should be freely given. I don't know that it should be, I worry about instances where a biometric verification request is presented as an either or. You either provide this verification or you can't use the product. That doesn't seem to me to be very fair to consumers. So I think that TLDR version, biometrics are better than we're doing now. There's a promise of helping a lot of consumers and reducing the risk, but it needs adequate safeguards.
That's great. James, you have anything to add to that?
I agree with all of that. I guess I would raise maybe one other, it's kind of a broad issue, and that is we do have to make room for verifying people who don't have the tools that will be necessary for biometrics. Not everybody's going to walk around with a smartphone in their pocket.
Absolutely.
Not everybody has high-speed internet. Not everybody has a camera on, if they do have high-speed internet. We have to make an equally robust, equally as accurate, but second path to verifying identities, so we don't leave a significant part of the population behind. You know, the tools will get better over time. The accuracy will get better. The security will get better. The tools will get better over time because that's just the nature of technology. But as that happens, we run the real risk of leaving a chunk of people behind. They can't catch up to where we are today. They have no prayer of getting to where we're going. So we have to do that. And the other thing I would emphasize that this is part of a system. It is not a standalone. It's not a silver bullet. There is never any one thing that can be done or any one thing that causes something. And in this particular case, there's a lot that needs to go around it, starting with data minimization. If you don't need it, don't collect it. If you do need it, as soon as you're through with it, get rid of it. If you have to keep it for a regulatory or compliance purpose, make sure it's encrypted and it's stored securely. If we practice good data minimization, that in and of itself makes a lot of other issues go away. And then you add these other tools on top of it, and you begin to build an identity verification process and institutionalize in everyone, whether it's the digital path or the analog path, everyone has a better understanding of what's at stake and what they gain by participating.
That's great. Thank you very much. You know, I was on a group of folks who wrote in Canada. There's a digital identity framework called DIAC, and they've been a leader in trying to structure a safe and efficient identity framework for consumer use in Canada. And we wrote the best practices. You know, we had some recommendations for best practices for governments and for consumers and for corporate stakeholders. And, you know, what I'm hearing from the panel right now is starting to sound like best practices, right? At FaceTech, we have a series of best practices. We ask our partners to adhere to them. Sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. You know, but if we were going to talk about best practices for biometric vendors, where would you begin, Arun?
Yeah, so I really like what James just said, like start with data minimization, think about the use case, find a technology or set of technologies that support the use case, not only in terms of like it's a natural fit for the process, but also easy for people who are not experts in technology to understand how to use. Usability is I think sometimes when we look at some of these, I look at organizations and they put out these numbers about how much fraud they prevented. And I wonder how much of that is actually a legitimate user who just wasn't able to complete a process. I know that that's personally happened to me, and I know this technology better than the vast majority of people, but it still failed for me, right? Usability and accessibility are really important. Have procedures in place to handle people who are going to have difficulty. For onboarding or for verification, whatever that might start to look like. When you do your biometrics, select your biometric technology, look at stuff that's been tested well, that has a proven track record. And ideally where you have some sort of independent objective data to help you figure out, like, do I think that this is working well? Obviously, nothing's going to be perfect. It's really about finding technologies that work and then layering it within secure processes elsewhere, right? This is always a layered process. And this is one of many layers. The nice benefit here is this is, again, what I like is this ties it back to a real human being somewhere. If you do, and I think you do need to really look at doing facial recognition or biometrics along with things like presentation attack detection or liveness, making sure that that's actually like a real human being or of a human being through the sensors on the device or other things that might happen, right? And this could be as simple as, like when you do, Face ID on your smartphone, like they're looking for things there so that if I just took a photo of me on the wall and try to open my phone, it's not going to work, right? There are things in play. Not all of them are perfect. In fact, probably none of them are perfect, but it's about closing that risk, making it more challenging for bad actors, and then honestly keeping on top of it so that as new technology comes out that's better and better, look at refreshing your technology stack so that it can be more effective. Sorry.
Yeah, that's great. I just have one follow-on question, as someone who knows more about this than the vast majority of people, were you saying that as a DHS person or a advisor to the ITRC?
I, as a private citizen, know a lot about biometrics. Yes.
That's great. How about best practices, Stephanie? What do you think?
I was just going to add, since FIDO Alliance is one of the sponsors here, to just give a plug for some of the work that's going on there. And you're going to hear a whole talk on it, but this is biometrics based on open specifications that are developed by experts around the world. So the FIDO protocol for authentication, the certification program, same thing, grounded in ISO standards and testing and requirements set out by the experts in both industry, government, and academia. The Biometrics Institute has a good practice framework, which has a set of hundreds, I know, of questions, I forget how many, that really lay out the questions you should be asking as an organization, along the kinds of things related to data minimization, getting consent, and what's your accommodations and your secondary processes, et cetera, et cetera. So there are a lot of resources out there that you can look at, as you're thinking about adoption and adding biometrics as a layer.
That's great. So I have to admit, I've watched Minority Report about 10 times over the course of my life, and there's a lot of scary things there. John and James, you both really have kind of a consumer focus instead of a technical focus. If I was an everyday consumer trying to open a bank account or trying to do something online, and I was suddenly presented with the request to submit my face or whatever biometric, what type of disclosures do you think the consumer deserves or should receive before they are asked to move through that process?
Well,
Go ahead.
Should the consumer receive a disclosure? Yes. That disclosure should make it very clear that the biometric is being requested, but the consumer has a choice on whether to provide the biometric or to find some other form of verification. Now, and I think that is about as much disclosure as your average consumer can probably process and act upon, right? Telling my 83-year-old father-in-law that you have a data retention policy in place and that your facial data will only be used for the purposes provided above, please click here for a 500-page legalese document. That is not intended to provide any value to him or, frankly, almost any consumer who would, at that point, be making a decision. What I think would be a better information to provide in a disclosure would be to tell people what their rights are, and have a link to those rights. That I think is a better thing to include in a disclosure. your rights under state and federal law, for example, I think is a useful thing to know. And it's designed to instill confidence in the consumer who's about to make a decision on whether to provide this information or not. So I think, we also need to like make sure that those rights actually are in place and that they are as strong as they can be. To build for a moment on what Stephanie and Arun were saying a moment ago about best practices, one of the things I worry about is that having these best practices in place is really important, and we will have lots of companies, including many of those represented in this room, who will be eager to embrace them because they're the right thing to do. But I worry that as good companies start to embrace this in a way that in biometric verification in a way that's secure, you will end up with the bad guys sort of you're squeezing the balloon in one place, they go to the long tail. You'll have this long tail of people who have all this data that's still valuable, who will start getting targeted more by the bad guys. So I think as part of our plan for how we develop a strategy for rolling out biometric validation and devaluing the value of that stolen data, I think we need to think too about how do we make sure that long tail doesn't get left behind, because consumers are still going to rely on companies that are in that sort of less safe area. So don't forget about them too.
Maybe a best practice would be to ensure that you provide an alternative verification or authentication strategy or option for people that can't or won't participate in biometrics.
Yeah.
How about you, James? What do you think about best practices?
I'll put on my hat as a person who has owned every single Apple product they've ever made.
Even the Mac Cube?
Yes. I had
2C working for you.
Not only did I have a Newton, I had a Newton too.
Nice.
With a PCM CIA card in it with a modem that you could connect to absolutely nothing, but I had it.
He's still my beating heart.
Yeah. This is a general critique of a lot of things that we do involving technology, period, not just what would be going forward here. And that is, we don't explain the why. We don't give consumers a basis for why we're doing this in a language they can understand. And I think the key to making people feel comfortable and confident is to explain to them in terms they can understand, here's why we're doing this. Here's how it's going to make you more secure, and here's the benefits you're going to get from that. If we start there, respecting their intelligence, respecting what they're trying to get done, and talk to them in a way that reflects that, we're going to have a lot more people who will go, okay, I see that. I'll do that. I'll do that. That is what is missing in so many of these kinds of conversations, not just about biometrics, but about the role of technology and the data and data collection, period, is we don't ever explain the why. If we start with that, a lot of the other issues we deal with will go away.
Right. Oh, that's fantastic. Thanks. So I think we have a minute or two left. I ask a lot of questions, but I wonder if anybody in the audience has any questions.
Hi, I'm Ross Ford, and I want to ask a question. Anybody on the panel can take it about data minimization, right? If we do this the way we've been doing with every .com, taking my biometric information, James, do you think that'll have good results?
John, don't you want to answer that first? It's going to require a different framework. There's no question about that. It's going to require a different framework. It's going to have to require a different set of, well, beliefs is the right term, but you're going to certainly a different level of respect for the data than what we see today. Because I can't change my biometric. And now today, there's no real way that you can adopt that in practical terms. You can't make my face. I can assure you, you wouldn't want to. But it's still reduced to a series of ones and zeros. It's your DNA is reduced to a code. We've got to have a different level of understanding of what happens if that is compromised in some way. Oh, sure.
Nope, that's me.
So I think we've got to build that in at the foundation level, because look, the systems that exist today are the early systems. We still have time to build in a very robust respect level.
Can I just add to that? That I think this is where you were going with it. The solution doesn't necessarily have to be that every single company now also needs to hold your biometric data, right?
Yep.
Right. And so there are ways to put, I mean, FIDO protocol is a perfect example of that. You're proving yourself to your device, and then the device through cryptography does the back end work instead of passwords. And so now that doesn't work as well for the remote identity proofing, but there are, you know, with what's going on with the mobile driver's license that we heard initially and the passport ecosystems, these things are changing, and they're changing very rapidly. And I think it's a great time to sort of move away from that model that every single organization has to hold all the pieces of information and make them a big honeypot and you know, put you out of a job, hopefully.
I would love that.
It's, I see Teresa. Oh, we have one more in the back. Okay, sorry.
Judith Hellerstein. So you talked about the biometrics and the hacking, and the other thing is now that we're going more of the biometrics and more of the live and taking different snapshots, what about companies like Clear or others when they get hacked and then your biometric is stolen, and in the live, all those little other ticks that are needed are also then hacked? And then we're back to even less than square one. That's putting on my doomsday hat, because they will be hacked. Everyone will be hacked.
I don't know if I can comment on Clear to be.
All right, I think that, you know, we do some work with deepfake technology, you know, and I think there's a certain sort of sense that that's kind of now the new 0 day for biometrics, that deep fakes can simulate completely your corporal, you know, selves, right? But I think we're really a very long way from that piece, because ultimately those deep fakes are a digital representation, and they may look good from a, you know, I can't tell whether that's Obama speaking or whether that's a deep fake, but from a biometric system, they don't look good at all, right? You know, because it's shown on a screen, right? You know, or it's digitally injected, and it lacks, you know, the information that can be randomly injected, you know, in a real session. So I don't see that as a huge threat in the near future, but we need to be aware and be building in, you know, the extra protections. So not all systems are equal and are able to handle that, those considerations.
We are basically out of time, but
Yep.
Arun is raising his finger.
I just wanted to close that. So I'll keep my comments kind of limited, but it worries me. It does, right? So, and I think it's important where this is where some of the things like presentation attack detection, like having good means in place to try to make sure that this is really that individual versus just re-recorded, you know, face photo, fingerprints, iris images that were collected before, and you're getting like a replay attack. I also think, you know, there was a discussion about a different framework. I know that when you put in, like if I were to take it, you know, Stephanie's information, type it in, apply for something, abuse it, try to steal money, sometimes the burden of responsibility falls on Stephanie to prove who she was or that it wasn't her. I think for some of these things, we may have to rethink that balance where the company has to say like, hey, I use this liveness proofing technology, so that's why I think it's you. And it should, and the burden may have to shift, or we may have to rethink this balance about who's responsible for what when fraud does occur, because you're right, fraud will occur.
Well, that's about it. Can we have a strong round of applause for the panel? Thank you very much, everybody.